So there are 11 Incoterms. EXW, this is ExWorks. FCA, this is free carrier. FAS, free alongside ship. FOB, free on board. CFR, cost and freight. CIF, cost, insurance and freight. CPT, carriage paid to. CIP, carriage and insurance paid to. DAP, delivered at place. DPU, delivered at place unloaded. DDP, delivered duty paid. Out of this, you can see that the four which are marked in blue are specifically for the transport of sea and inland waterways. And the remaining are used for, they are general and neutral terms which can be used for any type of transport. They can be used for sea carriage, road carriage, rail carriage, as well as air carriage. But these four, that is the FAS, FOB, CFR and CIF, are specifically for sea carriage. So I would recommend you to keep a copy of this chart ready when you are listening to my lecture on Incoterms. And you see over here there are icons on the left. Here this is for the seller, and over right you can see, extreme right you can see, is the buyer. And in between these are all the stages that I have explained initially. What all stages take place in an international trade, the major stages like loading, unloading onto the first carrier. In our case, the first carrier would be when the goods are loaded onto the truck and they travel from Nottingham to Southampton. That is the first carrier. Okay. uh, so these stages of trade are depicted here in these icons. The first carrier, like I have said, is the truck carrying the goods from Nottingham to Southampton. Alongside ship depicts the goods reaching the port. The next stage is the loading port, which is the Southampton port. Okay, in our case it is the Southampton port. Then here then there is a ship icon over here which depicts the actual carriage that is taking place at the sea. And just above you can also see that there is a plane icon. So this actually chart is it's made for air and sea carriage both. Okay, so the same rules will apply even if it is for a for an air carriage, except that there are four Incoterms which I have mentioned before, which are specifically for sea carriage. The rest are applicable to both. And then you see the stages in reverse. It's just the opposite. Again over here the destination port, which is the Antwerp port, alongside ship, final carrier which is taking the goods to my warehouse in Brussels, and finally my warehouse in Brussels. Okay. So the blue bar over here shows the seller's obligation over here, and everything in brown is the buyer's obligations. And you see that when you start from the first Incoterm, that is ExWorks, the seller's obligation is the least and the buyer's obligation is the most in ExWorks. And as you keep going down, the buyer's obligations reduce and the seller's obligations increase. Incoterms are often, or all, in fact, not often, but are always mentioned with the name of the place. So if I say FOB, I won't just say FOB, I will say FOB Southampton, which means that over here, Southampton is the loading port. And at this stage, that is at Southampton, the seller's responsibility ends, the buyer's responsibility starts, and the risks transfers from the seller to the buyer. If you see in ExWorks, the seller's responsibility is only till the time the goods are in the warehouse. I mean, the seller has the least responsibility in ExWorks. In the very first stage, his responsibility ends. So ExWorks Nottingham would mean that the seller's responsibility is only till Nottingham, is only till his warehouse. After that, it is the buyer's responsibility, and the risk also transfers at this stage, that is before the goods are delivered to the first carrier. So let's have a recap of ExWorks. The seller makes the goods available at the factory or warehouse, and the buyer is free to pick the goods from there. From this point, that is the seller's warehouse, the buyer assumes the responsibility for transporting the goods to the final destination at the buyer's cost and risk. Here there is maximum transparency and control for buyer, and there is minimum hassle for the seller. You see that the buyer is actually paying only for the real cost of the goods. There is no other cost factored in this price, because the seller has no other responsibility apart from just manufacturing the goods and making it available at his warehouse. So this is beneficial for buyers when they want to consolidate different cargoes from different sellers. If I am a buyer and I have 10 different sellers, and all of them are, say, in or around Nottingham, I will want all of them to I can collect the cargo from Nottingham, from the different places, in and around Nottingham, and then I can arrange my own carrier for that, rather than paying every seller a different price for every carrier that they are arranging for me, right? So the buyer may have multiple sellers and may get goods from different sellers. So then the buyer can just consolidate all of those multiple cargoes into one single cargo, and arrange for his carrier. So many times buyers, if they are getting the goods, sourcing the goods from different suppliers, from different sellers, then they prefer this. They prefer ExWorks. Although the responsibility is on the buyer, but as a business trade, they would prefer ExWorks in such situations. So there is freedom to the buyer to handle his cargo the way he likes, and this is beneficial when the buyer is looking to buy from different sellers in the same city. This is also good for domestic trade. In the domestic market, the question of export and custom duties anyways does not arise. So this ExWorks actually is very popular when there is no international trade, but there is only domestic trade. On the other hand, if you use this Incoterm for international trade, make sure that you're able to handle the carriage from the point of the warehouse, which is the delivery point for you, because you may have to hire third parties for this purpose. Now, if it is my known country, it's easy for me to arrange for a carrier, to arrange for the customs and clearance. But if it is a different country, then I will have to hire a third party, and this might entail considerable amount of finances, and there might be certain regulations which I may not be aware of. Okay. So another disadvantage is that the goods are in the risk of the buyer for a long time. So if I am a buyer, the risk transfers to me at a very early stage. So if anything happens to the goods during the entire voyage, then I would have to bear the risk. So I would have to ensure that I have appropriate insurance for that. Yeah, so but it is beneficial for the seller, because the seller is relieved of his responsibilities at a very early stage. Okay, another aspect to consider here, that the local rules also matter a lot. So if the seller is in the EU and the buyer is out of the EU, I mean the European Union, then the ExWorks is not feasible, because in the European Union, non-resident corporations are restricted to a considerable extent in completing the export declaration forms. So so that's why I was suggesting that if it is an international trade and the buyer is not aware of the local regulations in that foreign country, then either do not go for the ExWorks, or if you're going for the ExWorks, then you have to hire a third party. So a quick recap of the FOB. It is most commonly used Incoterm. It is specific to ocean transport. The seller's risk and responsibility is till the goods cross the ship's rail. That is when the goods are loaded onto the ship, and it is expensive because obviously the seller will charge an inflated rate, because he has to cater to the expenses involved in customs formalities at the country of export, and also he has to cater to the loading of the goods charges.